I have a coaching client, might say, they're stuck in this, or they really just can't get past this, even though they want to. They just feel like they can't get past. And that'll be one of my questions. Insensitivity, but how is that working for you?
Welcome to the You Are Not Your Trauma podcast, a show that reminds you that you are not alone, your experiences matter, and you are not defined by what you've been through. Each week, you will hear from the host and invited guests who have either personal or professional experience with trauma. They will share their stories and strategies for overcoming past wounds and beginning the journey toward healing and wholeness. Now, here's your host, a gifted speaker, author, coach, and entrepreneur, Harriet M. Harris.
Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of You Are Not Your Trauma, the podcast that brings hope, healing, and inspiration to those who have experienced life's most challenging moments. I'm your host, Harriet M. Harris, and I am so glad that you're here today. I hope that this show is an important part of your healing journey. Now, today we are exploring a topic that deeply resonates with many of us on the path of self-discovery and healing. Daring to believe I matter even after trauma. Now, in a world often overshadowed by pain, how do we find the light within ourselves to truly believe that we matter? Have you ever wrestled with this internal conflict? Because I know I have, and that's exactly what we're unfolding today. In this episode, we'll navigate through this powerful topic, unravel the threads of past traumas, and reveal the essence of self-belief that transforms shadows into light. Now, to guide us through this journey, we have the inspiring Sue Bowles with us. Sue is a survivor turned thriver, a celebrated author, speaker, and master certified life and mental health coach. She's triumphed over immense challenges and now shapes the narrative around her life-altering events. She's the founder of My Step Ahead and the force behind the Dare to Believe movement. Sue brings a wealth of wisdom and insight. Welcome, Sue. I am so happy to have you here today.
Thanks for having me, Harriet. I am really looking forward to this conversation.
Awesome. And as so am I. So, Sue, will you begin by sharing with us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So I am as you said, a master certified life and mental health coach. And in that, I provide one-on-one coaching. I also have some group opportunities. I do a lot of speaking, conferences, retreats, just a little bit of anywhere and everywhere, getting the message out there to meet the people where they are and to help them take their next step. I absolutely love it. And it is through those conversations with people after the event. That's where I love the most. It's just those one-on-one conversations afterwards, because that's where you really get a chance to hear the individual stories and have a chance to really speak into a life for just a few minutes that hopefully will help them take their next step.
Wonderful. That is amazing. Well, so I am very excited to have you here. I absolutely love the topic that we're discussing today. As I said, it's something that I have personally wrestled with, and just knowing that, sometimes it's nice to know that you're not the only person in the world that thinks like that. But I think it's so important, especially for people who have experienced trauma, to believe that they matter. I think it's one thing to say it, to an affirmation, or I think it's one thing where other people are telling you, but when you get to a point where you can believe it yourself, that is where everything begins to change. So I'm excited for us to take this conversation deeper, and we'll do just that right after our commercial break. We'll be right back.
Want a chance to win exclusive You Are Not Your Trauma merch? Here's how. Leave a rating and a review on your favorite podcast platform and share your thoughts with us. It helps us reach more listeners who may also be seeking healing and growth. Once you left your feedback, visit feedback.youarenotyourtrauma.com to let us know you've entered by entering your info and the word feedback in the message section. You could be a lucky winner. Now stay tuned for today's inspiring episode, and thank you for being a part of the You Are Not Your Trauma community.
Okay, we are back. For those of you who are just joining in, I am with Sue Bowles today, and we are talking about daring to believe I matter even after trauma. So, would you, if you're comfortable, I'd like for you to share with us a bit about your early life experiences and the trauma that you endured, and how keeping it a secret for 15 years impacted your mental health and your outlook on life.
Wow. Thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, there's a lot there to unpack, and I'll try to keep it in the concise version for our time limitations. I am a childhood rape survivor, and I was raped by a classmate when I was 7 years old after school one day. And this classmate was literally in first grade as well. And the last words my perpetrator said to me, he went out one side of the woods, I went out the other when my mom came looking for me. He said, "Don't tell anybody." And unfortunately, I didn't. I kept that secret for 15 years. And this was in the early 70s. Rape was not on the radar. It wasn't something that was discussed. And if it wasn't on the radar for me, I'm to the point now that I can have some compassion towards my perpetrator and wonder what was he exposed to or experiencing where suddenly he had that knowledge. So there was just a whole different time in life. And because it wasn't on the radar, no one knew to ask anything. And I didn't know what happened, so I didn't know to say anything. Through that, I basically shut down. My emotions were frozen in time. And when you think of age 7 as age of reason, you're really just starting to come into a person. And I didn't have a chance to be a normal child. I didn't have a chance to have a normal childhood. So I went through grade school and middle school, which is already a real hotbed, and then high school, all the way into college. Trauma literally rewires your brain, scientifically proven.
Yes.
So I started off course at a very young age. So the older you get, the further off course you are. So by the time I got to college, I was dealing with depression, not realizing I had depression, but I was depressed. I developed an eating disorder. Later, junior year of high school, I had thoughts of suicide, and then those came back in the 90s when my mom and dad divorced after 34 years of marriage. But it wasn't until my senior year of college, a few months before I graduated, so at this point I was 22 years old, that I finally told somebody. My dean of students had become my counselor, my confidant, and through a course in a conversation, I don't remember what it was to this day. I remember inspecting the weave of his carpet and saying, "Well, when society tells you not to say anything." And he was very astute to that. He asked a couple follow-up questions, which led to me sharing with him my story. Now, it wasn't until 2014 that I dealt with it. And what I mean by dealt with it is dealt with the emotions, dealt with all of the self-doubt, all of the self-condemnation, all of the self-blame. So over 4 decades after the event until I actually dealt with it. So my mental health was not well at all. And it was a struggle to stay in there and stay in the game. What made the difference was at a few different pivotal times was letting somebody else in. And I didn't realize then how key that step is. And it's the hardest one. That hardest one is the first one. The first time I let somebody in was in 1990. I was on a ski trip, and a dear friend of mine who's a Christian musician named Billy Sprague was on the trip. He had lost his fiancée 3 years prior and had considered ending his life. This is when my folks were divorcing. And again, I was imploding. And I looked at him the last day and said, "I need to learn from something you've gone through." I said, "How do you go on living when all you want to do is die?" And he's like, "What's going on?" And we talked. And at the end of that conversation, his words to me were, "That's all I know to tell you, Sue, step by step." Because he had a friend challenge him to start watching his shoes in the airport. And with each step, tell himself, one step closer. I made it this far. I can make it again. And he had me watch, and he had me watch my boots on the way to the ski slopes that day. And my first thought was, God, it is a long journey, and I am not gonna make it. That was 1990. We're 2023 now. The power of letting somebody in is that first chip in the block of ice around our hearts. And it takes a lot more to chisel it all away, but you got to start somewhere.
Oh, wow. That is so powerful. I mean, whew, step by step, step by step. I appreciate those words. Because as a also trauma survivor, childhood trauma, rape survivor myself, I do understand, because sometimes it eats away at you. It was 3 decades for me. So I can completely relate to so much of what you just shared. But sometimes there are still moments, even on that healing journey, there are still moments. So the step by step, I don't know if our listeners, if that relates to anyone, but it definitely relates to me. So I thank you for sharing that. And you actually kind of already hit on my next question, which is, what was the pivotal moment or series of events? But it sounds like letting someone else in was that for you.
It was. And that took a number of different times. I wish trauma recovery was one and done. Don't we all?
Yes.
That'd be really nice. But it's one and do it again and again and again and again, because there are so many layers we have put around our hearts and our minds that by the time we get to the point of letting somebody in that first layer, we're peeling out just a little bit. There's a whole lot more underneath. So it's a continual revisiting of do it again and again and again. The way I describe it is, when there is a wound, it's bleeding. And until it receives proper treatment, it is susceptible to infection. And a lot of times, many times, unfortunately, when we experience trauma, we throw a Band-Aid over it. My Band-Aid was trying to make people think I was good, that Sue was your go-to gal and had no problems. Sue was solid, and you can count on Sue for anything, that Sue didn't have any problems. I was wearing a mask. That mask was my Band-Aid. Because and it took a form of many different ways. I was over involved in college. I am not a poster child of health in college. And the way I have come to understand it is that if I stayed busy, I didn't have to think. And if I didn't have to think, I didn't have to feel. And if I didn't have to feel, I didn't have to deal with my stuff. Right. So I wore a mask. So when we have wounds, we throw something, a Band-Aid, or whatever form it takes, over that. But underneath, it's becoming more and more infected. And at some point in time, we have to take the bandage off and deal with what is growing underneath. Now, the longer we wear that bandage, the longer I wore the mask, the worse it got, because I was buying my own lie. And then I started not believing that there were issues. It just becomes a cesspool. But what happened is that when I finally reached out, that first time was Billy. Actually, the first time was college, and then Billy, and then a number of other times. What that did is continued to keep that bandage off, and it started letting the antiseptic of health get in there. Now, anyone will tell you, when you have a burn, you go to the hospital, they got to debride that wound, they are digging deep, and it is not painless. Healing is painful. Healing sucks, to be totally honest. Healing sucks, and it is so worth it. So that by the time you finally scrape out all of the infection and all the scar tissue, then the wound can finally start to heal. And over time, that wound becomes a scar that then tells a story and can be a story of hope for others. But we have to do the work, and that work starts by reaching out.
You brought up a couple of things, but one of the things that kind of popped in is something that I love to say, and not because it sounds great, but because it's true, is that we have to deal with our traumas, or our traumas are going to start to deal with us. So deal with your stuff before your
Yes.
stuff starts to deal with you, because if we get ahead of it
Yes.
and try to start dealing with it, we have a little bit more control. But if we wait
Mm-hmm.
and wait for it to just implode, then we
Mm-hmm.
have less control over
Mm-hmm.
how we're going to work through it.
Right. There is a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it is a heavy duty book to read. It is a hard read, and it is an eye-opening read. And
I can.
I have I have realized that, my eating disorder is a result of my trauma, of not dealing
Mm,
with my trauma. Because remember, I said my emotions were frozen in time.
mhm,
So part of the whole persona I was portraying was Sue didn't have any needs. So I
mm,
went to a small college, and when I got hungry, when I got uncomfortable, because my brain was not thinking right, because I wasn't giving it the nutrients it needed, on top of the trauma and everything else.
yeah.
I wasn't sleeping well. I was, like I said, I was not healthy. So I was in the dining hall, and I would have enjoyed another serving of food. Typical, normal human need: food, hunger,
Mhm,
fuel for the body. And
mhm,
my body worked it out that, here are the generalities, everyone would know that Sue had a need, and my cover would be blown. So
mm.
I learned to shut off my hunger, dump my tray, and get the heck out of Dodge. And I'd snack in my room later. What that became was what I would call anorexic tendencies, or odd eating behaviors. I didn't even
Mm.
call it an eating disorder until I got with my counselor, who also specializes in eating disorders and trauma recovery. I've only been in
Wow.
recovery from my eating disorder since 2016, 7 years. And that alone has been a lot of work, because it means that I've had to deal with emotions, and
Mhm.
emotions and eating disorders are polar opposite.
Yeah.
So, yes, it trauma affects the body in so many ways that we may not even realize.
Wow. It's so interesting. I have heard this, the book, The Body Keeps Score,
Mhm.
that has been a book that has been mentioned on this show several times. I
Mhm.
actually just shared with someone recently that I started reading it just this week. It was one of those things where you've been, it's kind of been pushing and pushing, like being not pushed on me, but, just been suggested so much. I was like, and we just moved. So I finally found the book, and it was sitting on my dresser, and I was like, it's time. It is time to open this book. So I'm really excited. I've heard great things about it, so I am excited to dive in and really learn what there is to learn from that book.
Pace yourself and give yourself permission to put it down, because
Okay.
after the first couple chapters, when it really started getting in deep, I'm like, right now, I'm grieving the loss of my father. I am not ready to read this.
Mm.
So give yourself grace.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. And I hope, as our listeners, anyone who decides to pick that up, I hope that you heard that as well.
Mhm.
Give yourself grace if you decide to read this book.
Mhm.
Okay. So, Sue, the title of this episode is Daring to Believe I Matter, Even After Trauma.
Yep.
Now, how did you come to realize the importance of this belief, and in what ways has it been transformative for you and those that you work with?
Oh my goodness. So you talked in the bio about the Dare to Believe movement, and I call
Mm-hmm.
myself the chief instigator behind it. And,
Yeah.
and that became from, as I mentioned in the first segment, the conversations I've had with people after I speak at the merch table, coming up to the stage after I'm done speaking, at conferences, one-on-ones, my coaching clients. I started to hear a hint of doubt of,
Mm,
is it too late for me? Are you
mm,
sure I haven't screwed up too much? Am I too far gone?
mm,
I've put my life on hold. How am I, to raise a family, to support my husband or spouse in their career? Are you sure it's not too late for me? And what I have learned is that it comes down to that question. And you said it at the start, is that how we answer it. It's one thing to someone else say, I believe in you. I believe you
mm-hmm,
matter.
mm-hmm,
But I am convinced that until We can answer that question, each of us
Right.
individually, in the affirmative, in a
Yes.
bedrock, solid, foundational way, that I believe that I matter. Permanent
Absolutely.
life change cannot and will not happen. How that
Mm.
happened for me was through a series of retreats I attended. I am a Christ follower. And in 2014, a movie came out called Ragamuffin. And it was based on the life of the late Christian musician Rich Mullins. Awesome God, Step by Step were a couple of his big songs. And yeah, so that's Rich. So they did this movie. It was a really hard watch. And I did a lot of secret wiping of the eye, not because I couldn't be found out. This was still when I was wearing my mask. And I didn't want anybody to know that this was striking a bell and that Sue was hurting and had a need. So
Wow.
through this, later in the summer of 2014, the producer and family friends of Rich who were involved in the movie decided they were going to do a retreat to continue the conversation about the themes. So I went to my first one in October 2014, and I went in imploding. This was the year that I was dealing with the rape. I was not doing well at all. And I looked at my counselor 6 weeks prior and said, I just want to be authentic. Get me ready. Because my brother had served 18 months in prison for a drunk driving accident and had come home in August of that year. Saw somebody in town. I said, man, where you been? Haven't seen you for a while. My brother says, in prison. I'm like, in my judgment, if there was any cause for shame in a story, I would think that would be it. And when my brother told me that, I was convicted by that. I'm like, I need that. If he can do it, I can do it. So I went into that retreat calling myself the holy exception, believing the lies that I just spoke about, that I was too far gone, too screwed up, and just a waste of space. And that God couldn't, that I was believing the lie that, here are the generalities, everything in the Bible was good enough for everyone else but me.
But me.
And over the course, someone said that first retreat was like a Hail Mary for me, of taking a chance on love. Could God the Father really love me, and could his kids really love me when I was trampled on for so many decades? And I left that retreat for the first time experiencing what unconditional love really is. And I had grace to do the work I was there to do. And I took a chance on love, and I found I was accepted. Now that became something I went back to every year. In fact, this is September 23rd when we're recording this, 23rd, 24th, I apologize. And just last weekend, we were at retreat again. So I go to it every year. And through that retreat over the last 9 years, God has done a very deep healing work in my life. The first year I had to own my story because I was in denial about my story. I hated my story and I didn't want to talk about my story. And I had to own it. It's that first step of taking that bandage off that we talked about, taking off that first layer. I had to own my story. The second year I went back, I had to grieve my story. And that is a very important part of trauma. Big T trauma, small t trauma, any and every type of trauma is worthy to be grieved and needs to be grieved. Now that grieving may look different for each situation. Right. But it still needs to be experienced to bring that healing and closure. So the second year, I had what I call my sacred moment of release. My greatest fear was realized, and my greatest fear was destroyed. My greatest fear was that I would cry and I wouldn't stop. I cried really long and really hard for about 10 minutes, like heaving, kind of crying. And I stopped. So because I was grieving. And in the third year, the nugget I walked away with was I am valuable to God. And that is where things started to turn. That's when I started writing my first book. That is when I started to feel like I could start speaking. And then I was still healing, but that is where it started. So for me, daring to believe that I matter started with taking that first chance on love. And then letting myself take that next daring step, which whatever it became at that moment in time, those steps have become I have it on my website of the first 4 healing steps, the first 4 steps of the healing journey. And they're taken from my book. My book is called This Much I Know, The Space Between. It's on Amazon and Kindle. And it came out in 2019, won an award in 2020, which was wonderful. And From that, I pulled this out as just a free PDF to help people in their healing journey. And it talks about these 4 steps. The first one being humility, because until we realize that we are not well, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're still wearing a mask and you're still lying to yourself and others. And then those other steps of owning your story, grieving your story, and daring to believe. And within the PDF, there's a lot of different reflection questions to kind of get a gauge on where am I with each of these steps and what might be holding me back, to help them take the next step. But for me, it was taking the chance on love and being desperate enough. I was desperate enough to take a chance because nothing else was working.
Wow. Taking a chance on love and being desperate enough.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are very good points and very good steps to take to get you going. But what I really loved was where you talked about owning your story. And I just have to say how I have truly realized recently just how important that was. Just that transparency of being honest, not even just with everyone else, but being honest with yourself. Because you said something a little bit earlier, is that you were starting to believe the mask that you were, the front that you were keeping up.
I was believing the lie.
Yeah, believing the lie. And it's like, if we get to a point where we're not even able to believe ourselves, and really, what are we? And what else I really like is you said, I just want to be authentic. And that is not always something easy to not only do, but to admit that we're not doing.
Right. And that's part of that humility. That's part of that starting to peel the layers back. For me, in addition to my brother's influence in my life, the other thing that came along that just helped me start feeling like I can take that next step. And I have not had a chance yet. I'm praying for the opportunity to tell her in person. If I ever get a chance to tell Simone Biles the effect she has had on me. Because when she shared her story, when the whole Me Too thing happened, I was part of Me Too. My family did not know. And having someone else in the limelight have that courage empowered me. I wrote a whole blog post about it when it happened, about the power that gave me to share my story. Now look what I am doing. The power of one life who's daring to believe that they matter, daring to take that step. Look at the ripple effect of it.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's that it all comes back to that humility. When we're believing a lie, my favorite question to ask is, well, how's that working out for you?
Yeah.
When I have a coaching client, might say, they're stuck in this, or they really just can't get past this, even though they want to. They just feel like they can't get past, and that would be one of my questions. Insensitivity, but how is that working for you? Because we have to be, but because they've already taken that first step of humility and let somebody in, they've already peeled back the layer. So they've already demonstrated their desire for something more, and they're just stuck. I specialize in helping stuck people get unstuck as a life coach. And that's one of the ways, because when they come to me, there's already a glimmer of hope. They want something different. They don't know how to get it. I help them discover the steps to get it. And some of it is helping them realize, walking with them as they realize the lies they're believing and what they really want versus what they have right now.
That is super powerful. Sue, I just want to highlight those 3 steps that you mentioned before, just because someone may have missed them, but I wrote them down. And you said, own my story, grieve my trauma, and daring to believe. Those 3 things, I think, whether people know it or not, those are really, they're not going to be easy, but they are going to be so helpful to get them on that path to healing.
Mm-hmm.
Starting with owning your story, and I know we talked about that a bit, but I just really feel like it's such an important step, because we come up in a world where people are constantly telling you to hide the bad stuff,
Mm-hmm.
to quiet the things that aren't pretty, and that don't seem to fit in a perfect little bubble. But there's so much power in letting it out. But then grieving my trauma, I think, is still something that's super important, because you're giving yourself that permission to hurt, to feel the pain of it all, to deal with it. So, and then of course, daring to believe that what we're talking about today. And speaking of that, daring to believe I matter, that's such a powerful affirmation. Can you explain the significance of that message and how it captures the essence of your journey and message to others?
Wow. Well, the smile on my face says it all, first of all. And if I could, real quick, before I answer that question, you're talking about grieving your story. At the retreat, I was just at, and the retreat is called Walking Stick Retreats, and it's open to anybody. But at the retreat last weekend, one of the workshops was about grieving, and it talked about grieving our stories and setting stones, and moments of remembrance. And one of the things they talked about was that we grieve things from the past, grieve things of the present, and we also grieve things from the future of what may or may not be because of a situation. And so grief is not just I'm grieving the situation. Grief has different angles and different forks to it. And it's a triangle. And I just want to just briefly, it's a whole different subject, but just want to briefly mention that is that, we're grieving what may not be because of a trauma as well. So, so having said that, how does asking the question again, how does Dare to Believe?
I just said it. Can you explain the significance of that message and how it captures the essence of your journey and message to others?
Oh my gosh. It's a total 180. 9 years ago, I didn't believe I had a purpose in life. 9 years ago, I felt like I was a waste of space. And quite frankly, I may have been on the road to trying to hurt myself again. Because when you are stuck in that, when you feel you don't matter, then it starts really going down a slippery slope of, if I don't matter, if nobody cares, then why am I here? And that is a dangerous slope to go down.
Yes,
because it's hard. It's harder to crawl out of that until you reach out. So you even see how until you take that first step and reach out, that humility level. But for me, how all that summarizes where I am now and portrays that is that I am now able to be what I call a lighthouse of hope and a voice of hope for others. I am able to be for others what others were for me. I needed somebody to carry belief in myself for me for a while, because I wasn't strong enough to carry it for myself. That's what I hired my counselor to do. She is very good at what she does and continues to be my counselor. I'm now over 15 years with her, because not only did we have to deal with, get me stronger in the present so we could deal with the past, then we had to deal with the past, and now we're dealing with how the past is affecting my present. So, but then that gives me the launch pad for my future. So daring to believe that I matter for me allows me, first of all, to carry it for somebody else. My business name is My Step Ahead. We talked about that briefly in the comments that Billy said to me, and it also came out in a teaching at church a number of years later. The concept is this: our stories are the one thing that nobody can take from us. So my book, This Much I Know, The Space Between, this much I know is my story. The first half of my book shares my story in much greater detail. The second half, The Space Between, talks about that journey from wounds, healing, to scars. And within that, what does it take to help somebody behind you? You only have to be a step ahead. We
Yes.
tend to think we have to figure it all out, have arrived, have ourselves all together before we can be used in somebody else's life, before we have anything to offer anybody else. We want to say we have to have a meaningful life experience. And I am here to say that every life experience is meaningful and can be used to help somebody else. So while I'm still reaching out ahead of me to my counselor or to whomever to help me get stronger and keep walking, I have experience I can reach back and help somebody who's a step or two behind me. And together we have a human chain of support. That is the power of my step ahead. My business exists to empower others to share their story while they are healing. That is the impact of daring to believe that I matter, is that I am now out there on the cutting the waters, cutting the path, helping others walk behind and not behind me, but helping people take their next step while I'm still taking mine. And now, so my step ahead launched the Dare to Believe movement because it is so pivotal and it is the ground foundation of anything and everything else we do, because we will not take that next step of whatever it is in our life, be it trying to apply for a new job or looking for a promotion or leaving a job and pivoting to start a new career, until we believe that we matter. No matter how you slice it, daring to believe that you matter affects every single decision in your life, big or small. You may not realize it, but when you sit there and sort it out for 5 minutes, you don't apply for a promotion unless you believe you have something to offer. And you believe you have something to offer because you believe you matter, that you matter to that business or whatever. Yes. I don't speak if I don't believe that I have something I can offer to somebody else. You don't do a podcast unless you believe you have something to offer to somebody else. Every single thing we do comes down to that question. A yes or a no is you can trace it all back to the answer that you have to that question at that moment in time. And then the challenge becomes, if I answered no, then what is getting in the way? You talked earlier, I wrote it down, about shadows to light. Yes. One of the things that was on my heart at retreat was about shadows. When a shadow is cast, the light source is being blocked because something is in the way. You cannot get to the light. You only see the radiance of the light, but you can't see the actual source of it. So if there is something in the way that's not allowing me to say, yes, I believe I matter in this situation, then what is casting that shadow? And what needs to happen to own that story of that shadow, to grieve the effects of that shadow, and then dare to believe you matter, to move that shadow casting object out of your way. That is what I do as a life coach. I help people identify the shadows in their lives and what they want to do and what steps they're ready to take, and how I can equip them and empower them all the more to take the steps to get that shadow casting object out of the way.
Get that shadow casting object out of the way. Love it. So can you share some examples of how others have been empowered by daring to believe in their own worth?
Oh, wow. I would think, yeah, and I've got a number of different, things. I think of local high school class. I would speak on eating disorders at the local high school class. And one of the times I spoke, a couple of students came up afterwards, and one of them came up to me and said, "Can I talk to you? I have a friend and I'm not sure how to help her." And him just feeling that he mattered enough, that he knew he had influence in this person's life, and he saw a need in her life and wanted to know how he could reach out. This was a teenager.
Wow.
He dared to believe he mattered, and he cared enough to say something. And I can tell you that student has gotten help.
Wonderful.
All because that student felt he had something he could help her with. One of my life coaching clients, we worked together, but during COVID. And obviously that was such a time of everyone being isolated and shut in. Went from social anxiety and fearing reaching out, wanted to have coffee with somebody,
Mm-hmm.
but was fearing that. So we worked through the whole process of just making the appointment. And then after the appointment, next step was keeping it. But before he could keep it, we spent some time working through the anxiety and nervousness he had about it, thinking through he was thinking of the time he would have with his friend. Well, what happens if nobody says anything and there's dead air? And all those little things that that probably go through a lot of our minds. So we worked through all that. But I can tell you this, that when he came back after he had coffee, his face was so radiant. And he's
Wow.
and now, he working to lead a Bible study at church,
Nice.
all because he dared to believe he mattered enough that somebody else would spend their time with him. That's what
Wow.
that situation came down to, was, do I believe that this person cares enough that they would want to spend time with me?
Right.
So we dug
Right.
through, what is it that what are the thoughts that lead you to think that they wouldn't?
Right.
And
Right.
digging through that. So that's what I mean. There's those little things. Every decision we come down to can be traced back to. It might take a little bit of digging, but it comes back to, do I believe that I matter? Do I believe this person wants to, enjoy my company? Or do I see myself as a burden, and therefore I don't know that they would really want to spend time with me because I'm not worthy of their time? I don't
Right.
matter enough for them to spend time with me. That's what it comes down to. So any little way, I had another coaching client who was an architect out in Nevada and got tired of pulling permits. He wanted to start his own business. So daring to believe that he mattered enough to totally break out and do something totally new, he started a landscaping company.
Wow.
I had a coaching client down in Australia. So, I mean, so many different stories. It comes out in different ways. But daring to, and for me, it comes down to, do I believe that I matter enough that I have something to offer these people?
Right.
Do I believe that my life experience and my skills and my training to be a master certified life and mental health coach allows me to help these people, help these clients take their next steps? If I don't believe I have something to offer, I'm wasting their time and their money.
Absolutely.
It comes out in
Absolutely.
every little, no matter what, if you really sit down and think about it for 5 or 10 minutes and
Mm-hmm.
challenge yourself, you will trace it back to that question. I don't know that I matter. I don't know
Absolutely.
that I matter enough someone's going to want to spend time with me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, so we are going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll come back for one final question, and then we'll wrap up this episode. So we will be right back.
We are on an incredible journey together, sharing stories of resilience, hope, and the power of healing. To extend the reach and impact of the You Are Not Your Trauma movement, we've launched the Give 5 to Change Lives campaign. With just $5, you can contribute to developing invaluable resources like our upcoming You Are Not Your Trauma app, healing journal, and expanded podcast content. Every dollar and every share contributes to helping bring healing and hope to more people. We invite you to join this movement. Visit giving.youarenotyourtrauma.com to contribute. Together, we can change lives one heart at a time.
Okay, we are back. As Sue, I just got to say, I have really enjoyed our conversation so far. And to be perfectly honest, you've kind of already, just in your examples, given me some feedback to this next question. But because it asks a little bit more, I want to give our listeners just a little bit more information. So if you could just bear with me here, but in what ways do you think the act of daring to believe one matters acts as motivation for change and healing? And how can individuals create and reinforce this belief in their daily lives? especially after experiencing trauma?
Wow, what a great question, and so many different facets of that. Yeah, some of it we've already discussed in terms of how it can show in a life. In terms of, I'm trying to remember all the different points of the question. Ask me one more time. I want to make sure I address it all.
Sure, no problem. In what ways do you think the act of daring to believe one matters acts as motivation for change and healing? And how can individuals create and reinforce this belief in their daily lives, especially after experiencing trauma?
Okay, super. So how's it deal with motivating change and healing? I think when we are desperate enough to take the chance on love, and it may not be the love from other people, it might be daring to take the chance on loving myself. And we are great at putting ourselves down. We are great at saying other people matter first. There's a line between serving people and discounting yourself. And daring to believe that you matter can be the motivation for healing and for change when we start making ourselves a priority, not in a self escalating or self-elevating way,
Right.
but bringing us up to the same level as others. We elevate other people in our lives, but we leave ourselves an elevator step or two below.
Mm.
And when we can dare to believe we matter enough to say, I am equally important. And while, yes, I need to go spend time with this person, I'm equally important. And right now, that means I'm going to keep my therapy appointment, or I'm going to keep that coffee shop time for just me, or whatever it takes for self-care. All those little things that we discount as extras, as if I get to it.
Yeah.
But when we when we elevate ourselves to the same level as everybody else, then we start taking care of ourselves a little more, and that can come in all kinds of different ways. How can it then? I'm trying to remember how to phrase the last part of that question.
How can individuals create and reinforce this
Thank you.
belief in their daily
Thank you.
lives?
Some of that we already talked about, in just those examples. By, simply, I think, I don't want to say simply, because it is hard work. It is hard work to love ourselves.
Yes.
If you think about it, we were talking earlier about the images we wear. Think about Facebook, think about Instagram. You have Facebook friends, and then you have your real friends. So right there's a level of separation. And yet we spend more time worried about what our Facebook friends think of us. So we Photoshop pictures, or we sure make ourselves look good. And that's lying to ourselves too, because that's not how we are all the time, but it's the persona we want to portray. So if we can find that courage to have that humility, to then be able to be real with the friends who speak into our lives. Now, that could be a small group. That could be a friend you go out to coffee with. That could be the next door neighbor that you talk over the hedges with, whoever or whatever. It could be a family member, whoever, however it shows up. We have to be able to be real. We have to be able to risk taking off our mask so that we can then realize that it's okay to not be okay. That is one of the big lies out there. But thankfully, if something good came from COVID, it's that mental health started coming to the forefront.
I agree.
And there's been more conversation about things since then.
Yes,
because we started getting desperate. Because we started getting desperate enough to reach out. We have to maintain that desperateness. We have to stay desperate, and just, it's. I wish there was an easy formula. How to reinforce it is one step at a time. Find one way that you can value yourself in whatever way that is to makes you feel good about yourself. It might be a bubble bath. It might be a walk in the woods. It might be a day on a lake going fishing or hiking in the woods or whatever it looks like, male or female, whoever is listening. Going to a football game can be a part of self-care,
Absolutely.
especially when you haven't let yourself decompress for 3 weeks. So whatever way it looks like, give yourself the grace and permission to do it. That's how you reinforce it, is doing it the first time and then making another appointment with yourself to do it again and again and again. When I was writing my book, I put it in my calendar. I had a set day each month where I blocked off my calendar. I went to a coffee shop for 6 hours, and that's where I wrote most of my book.
Wow. That's dedication.
It was how I could reinforce that I mattered, that what I had to say mattered, and it mattered enough that I was going to give it concentrated time. I am part of a 20-author anthology of a book coming out in December called Breaking the Silence: Voices of Survivors. And I did the same thing with that. I set aside concentrated time we have one chapter, 3,000 words, and I wanted to very carefully pick those words because it matters. And I matter to be able to have a chance to share the story and encourage and challenge others.
Well, Sue, I just want to thank you for sharing today. You have shared some very insightful information, and I'm honestly hearing your story, witnessing your resilience, and learning about your journey has been incredibly inspiring. Your journey from darkness to light, from victim to thriver, instills hope and shows the boundless possibilities that emerge when we dare to believe that we matter. So you are a total inspiration. So now I want to invite all of our listeners to join the conversation. I want you to reflect on what daring to believe that I matter means to you. So share a moment, a thought, or a realization on social media using the hashtag daring to believe I matter, and tag You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. And let's create a wave of self-affirmation and healing together. Now, as we conclude this episode, keep this in mind. As we heal, we step closer to our true selves, finding our rhythm and embracing the melody of I matter. Now, to all of our listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode of You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. If you found today's episode helpful, please don't forget to share it with someone who can benefit from the information that's been shared. Also, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Check out the website, www.youarenotyourtrauma.com, to leave feedback, request to be a guest on the show, subscribe to the show, get information on show guests, or to get information about advertising on You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. You can connect with You Are Not Your Trauma podcast on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram at You Are Not Your Trauma podcast. And if you have a story to share, please email me at contact@harrietmharris.com. I'm excited that you have joined in on this journey of reflection and discovery. So let's continue to dare to believe, to heal, and to thrive. And until next time, remember, you are not your trauma.